It's really too bad that we've over-targeted as marketers, especially seeing that, hey, 50% of the time, it's not even effective, and we have all this bad data, so you might not even know who you're targeting, but we've targeted the crap out of people, and now consumers are getting sick of it, and we're having all these new privacy laws. We've almost shot ourselves in the foot with marketing a little bit. Hello, and welcome to the Marketing Architects, a research-first podcast dedicated to answering your toughest marketing questions. I'm Elena. I run the marketing team here at Marketing Architects, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Angela Voss, our CEO, and Rob DeMars, our Chief Product Architect.
Happy Halloween!
Happy Halloween, everyone. Scary topic today.
Trick or treat. Trick or treat.
I have a feeling you always choose trick, Rob. We're back with our thoughts on some recent marketing news, always trying to root our opinions in data, research, and what drives business results. Our topic for today is a spooky one. It's reach versus targeting. We've talked about targeting before with topics like contextual versus behavioral advertising, and we've also talked about reach before with topics like effective TV advertising. But we've never had an episode focused on just the debate in general, and targeting has been under some scrutiny in the marketing community lately with the publishing of two separate studies calling into question the effectiveness of targeting. So I thought this would be a perfect time to dig in. And we'll start, as we always do, with the research. The first article that caught my attention for this episode is one from Work titled, "Targeted Ad Campaigns Face Profitability Problem." In the article, Work summarizes a study from the International Journal of Research in Marketing, otherwise known as the IJRM. The researchers that conducted this study developed a model to compare the break-even performance of targeted versus untargeted ad campaigns on Facebook. Then, after proving the viability of that model, they took it and they applied it to Spotify ad campaigns. They found a few things. First, to match the profitability of untargeted campaigns, targeted ones need a significant boost in performance. Not surprising, since you lose reach when you add targeting and your prices go up, but to be precise, roughly 50% of the targeted campaigns they tested on Spotify had to double their click-through rate to outperform untargeted campaigns. And they also found Apple's App Tracking Transparency Framework, or ATT for short, had a worse impact on the click-through rate of narrow versus broad audiences when they looked at 86 different campaigns from 6 advertisers in diverse industries.
So if I can just ask a quick question here, because this is super interesting. How do they account for kind of that classic belief that a more targeted ad leads to a more qualified consumer, so therefore it has better lifetime value?
So they did look at lifetime value. They called it long-term margin. So the advertisers that they worked with, they included a calculation to see, basically, is it more profitable in the long term? They called it long-term margin. And they even had different levels. They had the low probability or medium and high. So they did look at not only short-term conversion, was it profitable, but that is how they got long-term margin.
It's a great term, long-term margin.
We need a new term. Why not? Why not add another one? But thank you, Rob. Good question. I wanted to move on to the second study because it offers another perspective about targeting that I believe backs up this first study even more. And this, originally, I read about it in an article from Ad Age by Jack Neff. And that article is titled, "Nearly Half the Data Used for Ad Targeting is Wrong." The article summarizes a study from a consumer database evaluation firm called Truthset, and they explored matches between hashed or anonymized email addresses and postal addresses. This study covered 15 data providers with 790 million unique hashed email addresses and 133 million postal addresses. And the average accuracy ranged anywhere from 32% to 69%. So on average, this data match was only right about 50% of the time. Truthset calculated this accuracy by comparing this data to a database of 20 million records from trusted, verified sources. So what drove the inaccuracy? Well, one major driver was the age of the data, but other drivers were things like people moving or just people having multiple email addresses. And the worst part about this was it didn't matter how large the database was. You would think that accuracy would get worse with big databases, but that wasn't the case. And you might be wondering, why does this match between email addresses and postal addresses matter for targeting? While it's a very basic match, it's an extremely important one because it underpins more granular identifications of people and households like age, gender, income, and more. So if you get this match wrong, it has implications for a variety of audience measurement and ad targeting applications. Marketers depend on data like this to personalize their advertisements. The study even went as far as to say that better validated data sets delivered an ROI of $1.56 per dollar spent versus just 67 cents per dollar spent for the least validated data sets. So these studies are very different, but they have some overlapping conclusions, one of which being the importance of data accuracy in positive targeting results. So Ange, that's a lot of data. It's a lot of doom. You're the CEO of an ad agency, and we utilize several different kinds of targeting. So what's your reaction to these studies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the topic of discussion here is the interoperability between data sets. And I think the irony in this as well is that by leveraging these data sets and trusting their accuracy, we're actually doing broad reach targeting when we're trying to do very narrow targeting because we're just delivering to the wrong person. As I reflected on it, it's like, how did we get here? And I think what really bothers me is when I think about just the sheer economic engine that's driving a craze around hyper targeting. If we think about it in a couple of ways, firstly, the consumer data industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. These companies are responsible for doing just that, understanding how hashed email connects to postal address and how that matches to whether I have a dog, how old I am, how many children I have, where I live, etc. And so that data being available in itself, I think, creates a situation in which marketers look at it and go, I should be using that. Obviously, that feels smart to a data marketer. And then secondly, and I call this out because we are an agency, we offer these services, but our billing model is very non-traditional. We don't make our money this way. But if you think about a traditional agency billing model, is not really akin to broad targeting. Brands hire agencies to uniquely dissect the tendencies and behaviors of their customers or prospect customers. And consumer research drives a lot of ad revenue for agencies. And then, of course, careful media consideration is given to trying to find those individuals, all by which agencies make money. So I guess it's unsettling for me in that there aren't a lot of advocacy groups to spread this type of research and insights. I think quite the opposite. And I think there's a lot more drive to over-target than there is to not over-target. And I think as data-focused marketers, we've grown to believe that if the data exists, then we should use it. But there is so much inaccuracy, back to the finding of these studies tied to that interoperability. And it's just widely unknown. So that's what we're trying to solve here.
Yeah, I've definitely heard marketers lament when stuff like this comes out. I think there is that negative feeling of, here we go again. Is anything going to change? But I do think there's a bit of a movement towards a return to normal with marketing and valuing reach. And you mentioned, Ange, how did we get here? And I was thinking about that too. And when I started to dig into just targeting in general, I thought it might be helpful to start at the very beginning because while now when we say targeting, we think about something very digital and very tech driven, it's been a marketing staple since advertising started. So Rob, we gave you a little homework. Could you give us a quick marketing targeting history lesson?
Yes. So for Halloween, I've decided to go as a smart person. So I really had to try hard here to see if I could live up to this homework assignment. But yes, there's 3 different sort of phases that seem to have identified themselves as you look at the history of targeting and advertising. The first phase being direct marketing. The second was really the rise of mass media. And then the last chapter being digital. And when you go back to direct marketing, it was actually interesting to find out that the first ad that was targeted was given credit to the Egyptians. Back in 1000 BC, they did an ad that was advertising a reward for a runaway slave. So that was considered the first targeted ad. Then in the 1800s is really when the sophisticated direct marketing that we think of today really happened with the creation of the Sears catalog. And the Sears catalog was a great example of them producing multiple versions of their catalog and mailing them out to different audiences. They even had a Sears catalog just for farmers, right? So, I mean, they were really starting to hone in that idea of how to target your audience. That really then ushered in a real boom of profiling audiences through mail and also through phone. The whole industry that's developed over list management and all of that good stuff really came out of that effort. And even today, we still receive stuff in our mailbox and we receive phone calls. Now they're robocalls, but they're out there targeting us. Then you had mass media, right? So we're talking newspaper, magazine, radio, TV. An example of targeting, obviously, like on radio, is when you would hear on the Lone Ranger ads for the Red Ryder BB gun, almost an earliest example of contextual advertising in some ways. And then lastly is what everybody's in love with right now, the digital revolution, right? You've got email marketing, social media, really an unheard of level of targeting. Anyone who has placed a Facebook ad is presented with just a buffet of different targeting options. That really kind of is the quick synopsis of the spectrum from the earliest of the Egyptians to bringing us today into Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook world.
As the historian of targeting, what era do you feel had it right?
Ooh. I'll say I always will continue to be a fan of the classic direct-to-consumer advertising that occurred at the early 1900s. I mean, that was really ahead of the time when you think about where we were then and to where we are now. I think, your classics, your Ogilvies of the world, they had their finger on the importance of that 100 years ago.
Crazy how long ago that was.
I like that time in advertising because it was a simpler time as well. And today, marketing in general is so complex, but targeting too is a marketing topic that's, I think, really misunderstood. And there's always this language challenge when you talk about targeting. So I wanted to take a moment to just define some terms before we talk more about reach versus targeting. And the studies that I quoted earlier and the way we've been talking, they use targeting as a catch-all. But there's a few other targeting terms I see frequently in marketing content, things like hypertargeting or tracking-based advertising. So to clarify, when we say targeting, we're talking about segmenting your marketing to a specific group of people with similar characteristics. It narrows in your audience. And under that giant bucket, there are a lot of different kinds of targeting and degrees of targeting that vary in their benefits, their prices, and even their danger to an advertiser. And these could range from behavioral targeting to contextual targeting to tracking-based advertising. And as far as hyper-targeting, I've heard that, and we've said that a little bit, and that's a term that's just sometimes used to describe a real extreme kind of targeting. And I think, personally, I've used that word a bit because when you just say targeting, I think it's so broad that sometimes people get a little bit annoyed by it because we're not saying targeting is bad. That'd be a very silly thing to say. So now we're just creating, as a marketer does, we're just creating more words to try to clarify it. But so I wanted to get that out of the way before we get in any sort of trouble for that. But and with that said, what side of this reach versus targeting debate do you land on?
I think to your point, we're not here to be exclusive and say that all targeting should be done away with. All of our campaigns are targeted. We really lean into what's being coined in the industry as sophisticated mass marketing and have done a lot of research and discovery that goes into our understanding of our clients' audiences. And we take the approach of identify that bullseye target, but then also understand the secondary and the tertiary targets. I know we've used that language before, so it shows up here again. And so to the point of definitions getting muddy, I guess I'd say I'm 100% against targeting the bullseye at the expense of all of the other audiences that could be considered influencers or light buyers. All targeting to either the bullseye target or to a tertiary audience has to happen at the right cost, right? In order to drive effective sales. But excluding anything but that bullseye target should be giving marketers some heartburn, some spooky heebie-jeebies on Halloween. So that's sort of where I'm at on it. But reach versus targeting, Rob, where are you at on it?
I really go with what you guys have been talking about in terms of cost having to play a factor. I mean, you can reach that perfect person, but at what cost? And then at what point does that even make sense anymore? So I like the framing of the long-term margin. I got to use that 3 times now in order to own it. But I think looking at the math all the way through the funnel just obviously makes sense. And I think it can be really easy to get myopic at one point of the funnel and get your undies in a bunch on just one outcome versus looking at the whole totality of it.
I used to be more in the bucket of, well, it all depends on your audience. But then with everything that's come out recently about B2B decision makers, I've sort of changed my tune because I always thought, well, imagine if you were a marketer selling to like this specific thing to this specific person. And I think B2B is a great way to talk about that because you can imagine all the very complex B2B purchases that are made. And now that we know how many people are involved in a purchase decision, it feels like even for the most complex category, there is value in going beyond that bullseye. But like you said, and it depends how many people are beyond that. So some brands, it's going to be more profitable to narrow in different ways than others, and people have different audiences. And like Rob said, we like to think about everything works at zero, and we focus on cost because we're performance marketers. But I also think that with the privacy changes that are occurring, I know that we've been talking about that for such a long time. We're almost desensitized to it, but it's really too bad that we've over-targeted as marketers, especially seeing studies like this on the fact that, hey, 50% of the time, it's not even effective. And we have all this bad data, so you might not even know who you're targeting, but we've targeted the crap out of people, and now consumers are getting sick of it, and we're having all these new privacy laws. We've almost shot ourselves in the foot with marketing a little bit. So in my mind, not only does it make sense, I think, from a marketing science perspective to start thinking, how can I start with reach rather than fixating on this one specific person? I think it's also probably a good idea in the long term as more and more privacy laws are passed. And I think that it would be the best case scenario if, hey, it actually works better and you can follow privacy laws. It's better for the consumer and better for everybody. So I definitely now fall more on the, okay, instead of starting with this specific customer, let's understand who they are, but let's try to be as broad as possible in our marketing.
I think the other side to this, though, that I think is exciting as a marketer is our ability to do mass customization like never before. My dad was in the catalog business, the mail order catalog business, and I remember him talking about it was such a big deal when they could print the person's name in the headline on the front of the cover. And that was just like, whoa, it blew everybody's socks off. But now you look at what's happening with AI and on-demand video generation that can be customized down to the end user. Hopefully everybody wins. That becomes a better experience for the customer. And then also, a really interesting experience as a marketer to be able to reach people that way.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. And I think that we've seen little glimpses of that with TV advertising where we're starting to see more ads that are based off of like the content of a show or targeted towards that audience. I do think it's going to be really hard in TV to ever get down to exactly who's watching the commercial, right? Just because of the way that people watch TV. But I think that I'm a pretty big fan of using contextual advertising to customize creative. Like, hey, I'm watching The Bachelor and then I see a commercial for a brand and their spot is some sort of Bachelor spoof. That's just more delightful. But I question just how precise could we get with something like TV because there's shared accounts and people watching together. Isn't that always going to be a challenge with television?
I think we're going to see more and more of it in the streaming side. I just think there are opportunities to be able to customize down to a level that is going to make our head spin. It's going to take a little while for the technology to catch up, but it's coming.
I think it's the strategy of the customization, because I think what these data reports are saying is that if half the data is wrong, we think we're personalizing creative to Snoop Rob, lover of Halloween, and a lot of other things that we probably shouldn't talk about. And hopefully we can get this personalized creative in front of him. But if half that data is wrong, then guess what? We just delivered to Susie, who's in the house or something like that. And that's just multiple people being in a room, which is sort of a different issue than just this underpinning data being inaccurate. And there are things that the industry is doing to try to improve that, just adding metadata and things like that help you understand when was that data captured, so that if it is old data, you can purge that. And in theory, that might help. But I think you're right, Elena, that we have to be careful with how far we go with personalized creative, customizing creative to different messages and approaches and segments so that we can reach wider audiences. That might make sense, but we have to be careful with the accuracy of that data.
I love Halloween, so I'll err on the side of creepier the better, but yes.
I do think there's also some data on how much personalization drives a return. And I'm not going to talk about that because I haven't looked at it recently, so I don't want to. I hopefully appear to be smart on this podcast, so I don't.
You're right, though. It's a whole other episode, but there's a lot of data out there that says that the best performing creative is the best performing across multiple segments of consumers. The other thing, too, that I think comes up here is a marketer that's working with $100 million in budget has a different challenge and opportunity than a marketer working with 10 million in marketing budget. And I think a lot of the pushback that we have heard has been, I absolutely care about my secondary audiences and my tertiary audiences, but I don't have that much marketing budget. So how do I balance between underserving that core? And I think that's where people start to lean more into frequency over reach, because they go, well, I really want that core then to be effective. And so I want to make sure I deliver to those people. Okay, well, who are we delivering to? That's the underlying issue. Who do we think we're delivering to versus who we actually are delivering to? And there's a lot of data and research behind reach over frequency, just in terms of driving sales. And to the point of, we can't always trust the data we have. We don't know who's in market for your product or service and who isn't. And so at the right cost, that's where reach comes into play and becomes that biggest driver for growth.
TV is the most powerful marketing channel. It's first in effectiveness, leads for trust, and is number one in driving emotion. But it's also expensive, difficult to scale, and hard to measure. So we flipped the traditional agency model on its head and created all-inclusive TV. You get one bill for media. We cover everything else you need to succeed. So say goodbye to hourly agency fees and say hello to making TV work harder than ever. Visit marketingarchitects.com to learn more. So Ange, if I'm trying to think about a marketer that's listening to this episode, and so far we've talked about all this new research and data that's coming out questioning the effectiveness of targeting. And I do want to point out that the study, it did find that in most cases, the ROI wasn't there for these targeted groups, but there were some groups where it was. So it's not that targeting didn't work 100% of the time. It was working. And part of this study that I thought was interesting is these researchers, they want to turn this into a model that advertisers can buy to look into, how much should I be targeting to get a return? So if you were advising a marketer, would you just say, don't automatically assume targeting is going to perform better? Start from experimenting and try to look for those broader audiences? Or what would you say to a marketer who's just starting out and trying to decide, how do I target?
I mean, I think if you're a performance marketer, this is pretty simple because we have data, right? In terms of who responds. We just have to test broad enough to be able to see the findings. And I think I remember HP talked about that at a conference earlier this year in terms of their split in strategies, behavioral versus contextual. And to your point, not all behavioral targeting approaches are going to be ineffective. It all depends on what's the quality of the data that exists underneath it. But if we're testing wide enough and we're testing different strategies, we're testing some broad and some narrow, some contextual, some behavioral focused, we should be able to see that really easily and adjust accordingly.
Well, I think if I can summarize here for us, we covered a few different studies, just things marketers should have caution about when it comes to advertising. And I think we can end with that great advice from Angela, which is if you're trying to decide, how should I target my customer? How should I set up my campaigns? Having that test and learn mindset and being open to, some buyers, some influencers that might be outside of your core target might be something to consider. That's it for this episode of The Marketing Architects. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you find our show valuable, please leave us a rating and review. And if you want to know what the research says about some recent news, you can contact us at marketingarchitects.com/podcast. Now go forth and build great marketing.
What do you call a tub of Land O'Lakes in the freezer? Long-term margarine.
Oh my goodness.
That's funny.
So many talents, Rob.
Yeah.
You
Did
just
ChatGPT write that?